Yes.
So I see your YouTube channel. Where would
Yes.
the comments come in?
Yes.
Discussion?
Yes, good question. Hey, anybody answer?
I think I have it. Just give me a second.
Yeah. Yes.
There we go. I have it now. Oops. Okay, can you see my comment?
Okay. You can see on YouTube.
Yeah, but do you see my comment?
No.
Okay, let's try that again. I put it in discussion.
Okay, your comment. I don't see actually your comment. And
Wow, that's pretty strange.
is it maybe it is good idea to start? What you say?
Yep, 7:59. Sure.
Yeah.
You want to put your recording on?
Yes.
Good luck, everyone.
Hello.
Hi there. Good luck, Yusuf abi. Hi, Bob.
Hi, how
Hi.
are you?
Yes, we are now opening, Yavuz. Okay. Hello and welcome. My name is Yusuf Özdemir, and this is Bilişim Kahvesi Technical Talk, which is the second in the webinar series organized by the Information Technology Association. Let's not forget to like and share for continuation of these seminars held by Information Technologies Association. With me today is my guest is Bob Aiello. Bob, say hello.
Hi, how are you? And we're all speaking different languages. My name is Italian. It's Bob Aiello, A-I-E-L-L-O. Salam, it's a pleasure to be with you today.
Okay. Bob is a DevOps architect, trainer, and coach with over 30 years of experience implementing configuration management. And I think you know his book, Configuration Management, the application lifecycle management, and what we have come to call DevOps, DevOps with the practices. Yes.
That's right.
Yeah. The best practice in the large company enterprise, Bob organizations, Bob co-authored the IEEE 828 configuration management standard and is currently heading up an effort to write an industry standard for DevOps, which is called the IEEE P2675 DevOps standards for building reliable and secure system, including the application build, package, and deployment. So today's session is about enterprise architecture and DevOps. Dear audience, you can ask your questions on YouTube. I will read the questions on YouTube. I will ask the questions to my guest. Yeah, I want to explain briefly what is the enterprise architecture and enterprise architecture. And enterprise, very briefly, the structure formed by organization with common goals. This is the important point. Is called an enterprise. Architecture is the science of science and the art of designing system design according to specific dimensions and rules. You can say that. Yeah. What is the enterprise architecture? Very, very briefly, we can say that enterprise architecture is the architecture for the company. And the longer enterprise architecture is a document that manages the relationship between the organization's goals and strategies and IT systems and direct technologies that should be used in the enterprise. Yeah, this is very briefly entering. And after that, let's start with having you explain, Bob, what DevOps is and how it impacts on enterprise architecture.
Okay, so you give a nice summary there, but let me add to it a little bit. DevOps is defined differently in a couple of different ways, but the definition that I usually explain to folks is that it's a set of principles and practices that helps different teams work together more effectively. DevOps got its start in 2009 when some thought leaders went to a conference and they were thinking about the fact development wants to go fast all the time, right? And operations, they want things to work. They don't want the systems down. So it's two different perspectives in there. They're clashing. I mean, the developers want to roll out new features, but the operations team wants to slow down and they want to make sure that systems are reliable.
Yes.
So the heart and soul of DevOps is understanding that we all have different perspectives. Now,
Yes.
what makes enterprise architecture different is that you're very often implementing enterprise architecture in a bigger organization, right? And there's many teams doing work, there's many teams doing development, and you want a common set of practices. For one thing, if you're publishing different websites and different mobile apps, you want them all to have a common look and feel, right? If you're at a big company, if it's company ABC or a company XYZ, you want your customers to feel that everything that comes out of your company looks great and it's looks and feels the same. So you need an enterprise architecture group that drives common best practices across the whole organization. Now, I've been the DevOps architect in an enterprise architecture role, and that's where you're really taking these DevOps best practices, and we're going to talk about what some of them are, and you're working with the other enterprise architects and ensuring that there's some common ways of approaching how you do what you're doing. Okay, I see the coffee. So it's very important when you consider DevOps to think about how do I implement DevOps in a big organization? How do I make all the practices be consistent?
How do we scale DevOps to the enterprise? Yes, this is the good question.
Yeah, so that's really what our talk today is all about, right? So a lot of folks are very good at DevOps when it's three guys and they're building a new website. Okay, they can write the code, they can set up the platform in the cloud, they can push the applications out. But you're a big bank, you can't do that because if you're letting developers get into production, first off, you're going to get in trouble with regulatory authorities. You're going to find yourself getting fined. You're going to lose $1 million because you're going to get in trouble. And also, there's a real risk if a developer pushes something to production, that code might be moving money into his bank account. And then 3 weeks later, after he made $1 million, I mean, there was a movie that was made about this. So we have, in the real world, segregation of duties. There's lots of different rules like that. So my focus and the focus of my practice and my work is how do we do DevOps in these larger organizations that have to have an enterprise architecture. They have to have consistent practices throughout the whole organization, and they have to be a little bit more mature, and they have to really have what I call disciplined DevOps.
Yes.
So disciplined DevOps is where you're still looking to go incredibly fast. You want to be able to develop your systems at lightning speed. You want to be able to deliver value to your customers really, really quickly. But when the auditors come around, you also want to be able to say to them, hey, we know what we're doing. So, one of the most basic things, and this is a question I ask lots of folks. Can you prove to me that you really have the right code in production?
Yes.
And when I say that, there's a lot of people that work in banks and they can't do that. They move some code to production. Somebody else made a few changes. They're not 100% sure of what the exact bits are that are supposed to be running in production. Now, in my world, when we do DevOps, we have techniques so that we can push the code out to production and be absolutely certain that we have the right code there and prove it using cryptography. I mean, the cryptographic hashes like Max Shell 1 and MD5. But what I really want to focus on today is, in a big organization, a defense contractor, a large bank, how about a medical pharmaceutical? I mean, one of the most exciting things that I've worked on lately is this whole COVID-19 pandemic actually was an exciting time for those of us in DevOps because we got to help hospitals actually fight the pandemic using DevOps. It was such a cool thing. So being able to bring consistent practices through the whole organization, whether it be creating a new website or it's a mobile app or it's back-end systems, to have consistent strategies that are very, very secure. And if something goes wrong, can effectively self-heal. I mean, that's one of the important things here. In DevOps, we create systems that can detect if something's wrong and fix themselves. Isn't that cool?
Yeah.
So the whole notion of being at the enterprise is very important. Yes, Yusuf?
Yes. This is the question. This is very popular. The subject is the continuous integration, continuous delivery. What happened to accelerating delivery? The CI, CD, in very large company, because you are competitive at the time, because the DevOps is the two vertical. They accelerate the time to market and the quality to market. So what happened?
This is a really good question because a lot of folks think that if I'm disciplined, then I'm not fast, and that couldn't be more wrong. The discipline can help you go very, very fast, but I always explain it to people as if I'm in a race car and I'm on a track, I want the car to go fast, but not so fast that I go off the tracks, right? So I want to be able to go at the proper speed to go as fast as I can without having any problems. Yes. So in disciplined DevOps, we're saying to ourselves, we have the right controls in place so we don't make a mistake. Yes. And then we have 100% uptime. So let me just give you a scenario. If I'm working with a hospital system, do you want to have a situation where the doctor can't get to the records for your mom because the computer system's down? And that happens. That kind of stuff happens. It's terrible. So in disciplined DevOps, we're looking at the whole architecture and how do we deliver new features fast, but at the same time get right so that we don't make mistakes. So let me give you an example of fast. COVID-19 broke, right? And all of a sudden, we had to modify hospital systems to enable people to go get tested for COVID-19, right? So it was a very common requirement. And there were other people doing medical research about using big data, and they suddenly had to harvest data that they'd never touched before. So using DevOps best practices, we were able to help these organizations be able to get access to data fast, to be able to push out changes even faster. But we were always conscious of the fact you can't take down a medical system. A research system, maybe you can have a few minutes where people go out for coffee while you fix it. But if it's a medical record system, or let's say it's a system that dispatches the ambulance, you can't have those systems be down. So the whole notion of what we're talking about in disciplined DevOps is how do I make sure that I can do continuous integration, continuous delivery, and continuous deployment without making mistakes, so I can push my code out really fast. And one of the things that we're kind of evolving to is, well, what about testing? So testing's got to be continuous, right? So we're starting to talk about continuous everything. It's the notion that there's many different aspects of putting a system out there that's reliable. And I want to do it fast, but I also want to make sure that it is very, very reliable. So what are some of the things that I do? I use continuous integration, where I'm constantly integrating code from from two or more developers, right? And then I'm packaging things into smaller units. One of the things that I teach folks is don't try to do a big bang deploy where you've got 10 things you're changing, because if something goes wrong, which of the 10 things went wrong? But if I do a tiny deploy, I can do it fast. I can, and I've developed techniques. I can do it in the middle of the day, because I can update one node of the server, test it. The other nodes are still running. Nobody even knows I'm changing things. And then I do a rolling update. So
also we have regulatory and audit compliance by the way.
We'll get to that in just a second, but let me just finish the continuous delivery and continuous deployment. So the whole notion of, can I update systems fast, reliably, using DevOps techniques such as rolling deploys? And this enables me to do tiny deploys that are much less risky, and to be able to push out those changes and be able to fix them if something goes wrong. So I've only changed a small thing. So one of the things in DevOps we do is, instead of doing one big bang deploy, like some organizations do one deploy every 2 months and they change 10 different things. In DevOps, we typically do a lot of little deploys, and they're less risky. And if something does go wrong, they're easier to fix. Now, you ask about regulatory and audit compliance. And this is also very important to an enterprise. In an enterprise organization, you have rules that you have to follow. For example, there's what's called segregation of duties. You have to be able to, the person who writes the code is typically not the person who pushes it to production. And the operations team is separate from the developers. And there's a good reason for that. I mean, for one thing, it makes sure that nobody's doing any fishy business here where they're moving money from one account into their own account. So there's some security reasons there, but also prevents mistakes. So Yusuf, if you're working with me and we're doing a deploy together, and I wrote the code, and I ask you to do my deploy, I have to teach you every step, right? And then you're going to make sure that if I'm on vacation or I'm out sick one day, somebody else knows how to do the deploy. Now we both know. So I've eliminated what's called key man risk. And that's one of the requirements that you get in organizations that have regulatory and audit compliance. Another one is traceability. Can I actually prove that I had all the approvals to do a change, that it was properly tested? Maybe I've seen organizations try to push a change after production and they didn't really test it right. And then the system goes down, and think about this. You want to go out with your family to have dinner, and you go to the bank to get some money to pay for the dinner, and your card doesn't work because the computer system is down. So that's not right. So the whole notion that organizations have an obligation to have very reliable systems, that's where this audit and regulatory compliance comes in, and is so very, very important. And there's regulatory compliance requirements if you're a financial services firm, if you're in the medical pharmaceutical business. Each industry has their requirements, and everything that I've been talking about, and there's much more to it. And we're doing a lot of work to be able to make it clear what these requirements are.
Yeah.
All these rules have to be followed, and there's really just to create safe and reliable systems.
Yes.
So the whole notion of audit and regulatory, usually you have an internal audit team, and they're kind of like the policeman on the street corner who just make sure that you don't cross through the light when it's red. So they make sure that the team is following all the rules. And then you have an outside audit team that comes in, and they are a check on, is the organization doing the right thing? And
Yes.
then you have regulatory authorities that sit above that industry, and they're determining, what the rules are that people have to follow, right? And they're also determining whether or not organizations are following it. So,
Yeah.
so just to give you a good example, there have been a lot of incidents over the last couple of years where systems were penetrated by hackers and people's information was disclosed, right? Credit card information, personally identifiable information. And when they looked at what that organization did, they didn't have the right controls in place. They didn't really follow all the rules, and their carelessness resulted in harm to customers. So that's kind of the spirit of regulatory compliance. Unfortunately, some folks don't really look into it deeply enough and understand why the rules are necessary, and they just think it's an inconvenience. But if you really understand what's being required, it's in order to keep all of us safe. I mean, think about it. If somebody builds a plane and you're going to travel on that plane, do you want to make sure that the software updates to that plane are fully tested? I think you do, right? And if you have a loved one in a hospital and they're using a respirator, and there's software on that respirator, that's how the thing gets controlled. That's how it works. So if they upgrade the software to that respirator and your loved one is on that respirator, do you want it done right? And I got to tell you, I've worked with this is a few years ago, but I worked with some of the medical companies, and they were not upgrading the software correctly. And what they actually were doing, this is a while ago, it was kind of crazy though. They would have medical personnel upgrade the software on these surgical devices using a telephone.
Yeah.
And the medical personnel had no way to know when it was done. So they let it run for 10 minutes, and then they hang up the phone, and the update wasn't done. And they had no way to know. So the right practices were not in place. So what I'm talking about is in an organization like this, they have to have the right practices in place to make sure that the software is updated correctly, that you can verify and prove that it's updated correctly, that it's been properly tested, that you can prove what version you're using. I mean, a lot of folks are using now mobile apps for medical services, right? You got to make sure that that software is set up correctly. So the regulatory and compliance is really designed to make sure that things are safe and reliable for you and me.
Yes. According to regulatory and audit compliance for DevOps, is there any industry standards or frameworks?
Sure. So there have been industry standards and frameworks around for a long time, right? So some of them are international standards. One of them has gotten a lot of attention lately is GDPR, which is essentially the right to be forgotten. So it's a notion that if a company holds information about you, and you might be a little worried that that company isn't being as careful, and your information might get disclosed to hackers. So I've gotten a lot of notices. Change your password because your password was disclosed. What? Yeah. What do you mean my password was disclosed? What were you doing? Why weren't you, protecting your software? So it's a whole notion that I can require a company. Let's say I buy something from them, and I give them my credit card, and they ship it to my home. I can require them to delete all the information they have about me. And that's the spirit of GDPR. There are other regulations that are in place that have been in there for a long time, like Section 404 of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002 in the United States, for all publicly owned companies, that they have proper testing in place, that they have proper release management practices. And all of these things are related to security controls, they're related to reliability controls, and making sure that things are being done in a proper way. Now, I've been leading an effort at the IEEE to develop a new industry standard, and we're getting close to completion, and that's called IEEE P2675, which is an industry standard for DevOps for building reliable and secure systems. And we're also working on an international basis with the International Standards Organization. So what all of these efforts are about for industry standards and frameworks is to be able to put out and make publicly accessible sets of rules and approaches that help people build software that is reliable, secure, and from a DevOps perspective, I can deliver features fast, right? Because COVID-19 was not going to wait. So we were helping companies push out changes to hospital systems so people could get tested, so the research could get done, so the doctors could get into the information they needed. So it's interesting how DevOps in the last few months actually became part of dealing with the pandemic. And that's something that's very, very exciting.
Yes.
So we want to make sure that with all the practices we're talking about, we can do things very, very fast. But in an enterprise organization, it's not just 3 guys in a dorm room somewhere building a new website. It's hundreds, thousands of people working together. So the EA group has to establish common practices. How do I develop a user interface that's similar? How do I have the same database controls? How do I have the right security controls? How are my platforms being developed? Are they being developed in a consistent way? So the enterprise architecture function is responsible in any organization for pushing out these consistent approaches. And DevOps fits in perfectly with that because we are really helping people to communicate and collaborate more effectively. We're helping with deployment automation, which is one of the most important things we do. Techniques like continuous integration, continuous delivery, continuous deployment, all these techniques I mentioned before, pushing out tiny changes faster, but keeping them as simple as you can. So it's hard to make a mistake. So the whole notion of regulatory compliance, industry standards and frameworks, all of this is very important to any enterprise organization.
Yeah, good. We have some question. And
Okay.
Can I ask a question? Yeah.
Sure.
Mr. Gürkan says that, what is the relation between Docker and Docker containers in DevOps? Is it different, or is it so dependent nowadays?
Well,
yeah.
That's such a great question. So let's put aside for a second the word Docker, and we'll just talk about containers first. Now, I use Docker containers every day, literally.
Yes.
The whole notion of a container. Look, I have a container for my seltzer, right?
Yes.
So I go to the store. I want to get a drink. I want a consistent container so I can take and enjoy my drink, right? You have your coffee right there. Well, the whole notion of containers is that if I am in what's the Turkish word for enjoy your drink? Skol. The whole notion, if I'm a developer, I work on my desktop in something that is called a container, and then that container gets pushed to production and there's no changes. So what Docker and other container-based strategies have given us is that the developer can work in a container that looks, acts, and feels like production. And the effort to push that container to the test environment, to the staging environment, and then ultimately to production, containers simplify deployments, and they help us to deploy more quickly and also more securely and reliably. So containers have a lot of advantages. We could give a whole class just in container techniques, but the reason that it's so important to DevOps is that in DevOps, I want to be able to deploy fast and as often as I need to. So if I deploy something today and you change your mind, I mean, I'll give you an example. You know, with COVID-19, the advice that was coming out of organizations like the World Health Organization kept changing. So hospitals were putting out information to the patients, and the next day it was changing. So they needed a way. but look, that was good. They were learning more. They were trying to save people's lives. So being able to be responsive to that, to help deliver that message faster, to not be overwhelmed by, we can make the change 3 times in the middle of the day. It was okay. Because when you're doing these container-based deploys, it's much easier to update the software more frequently and more reliably. And at the same time, the developer's working in an environment that looks and acts and feels just like production, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
So is that does that help with the notion of why containers are important to DevOps?
Yes. You said that the DevOps are giving the developers isolated environment. We call this containerization, and we call it Docker, for example. So this is the part of the DevOps, and DevOps give us.
Yeah. So Docker is just one type of container, right? It's most popular today, but it's important. You know, it's like saying I'm good with Fortran. Well, Fortran's not used, but you know, Fortran was a great language years ago. So I got white hair. I used to program in Fortran. So
Me too.
So it's important. You know, when you think about containers, the strategy for containers may change, but the value of a container-based approach, that is going to stay pretty consistent because it's just a really effective way to do DevOps.
Yeah. And the second question from an enterprise architect, he is Olcay Korol. Olcay asked, enterprise architecture is about big design upfront. Agile DevOps practices defend and preach the opposite.
Nope.
How do you reconcile the two? Is there a framework that you use or suggest?
So I disagree with the premise. Okay.
Yeah.
So I've done enterprise architecture in agile iterative environments where we help the team go with a 2-week sprint or 4-week sprint, and we did just enough design so that we you know, understood what we were building. You know, the Pop and Deeks, who have used a lot of lean principles in software development, they talk about last responsible moment. What's the minute at which you're still responsible before you to make a decision? So I put off a decision until I have enough information to make the right decision. But what's that last responsible moment that I can still make that decision? So I've worked in organizations where we were where most of the teams were doing agile. We still had some who were doing iterative waterfall, which is okay too. But most of the groups were doing agile iterative development, and we still spread enterprise architecture views. We just did it to the last responsible moment. In other words, we had enough design in place to do the first sprint, and then we learned from that sprint and we changed our design. And then, you know, 4 weeks later, we had a new sprint. We delivered some software and we said, you know what? The way that we were approaching Angular, it's not the best way. We're going to change it. So we drove agile development, but the difference is the EA group would take what they learned from Angular in one team and teach it to the other team. Or even better, if I have a team in New York that's doing Angular work and they learn something about how Angular works, and they teach it to the team that's in Florida so they don't make the same mistake. Enterprise architecture is often driving communication and collaboration, which is at the heart of DevOps. So please don't think that to do things in an EA fashion requires that you be dysfunctionally waterfall.
Yeah.
And I say dysfunctionally waterfall because there are times to use waterfall, right?
Yeah.
You know, if you're building a circuit chip and it takes you 90 days to fabricate a piece of hardware, and there's no such thing as half a chip, your cycles are 90 days, and that's iterative waterfall. So there are times in which iterative waterfall is a requirement. You can't do an agile 2 to 4 week sprint. It's just not doable. It's like trying to get 9 ladies to do create a baby in 1 month. You know what? That's not the way the world works. So some things require a waterfall method. So I tell that joke at conferences all the time, and I get in trouble for it every time. So some things really do require a real flexible approach, an agile approach, but still with the right amount of discipline. And by the way, I want to point out that just because I do some design up front doesn't mean it's not going to change. And it doesn't mean that I'm not going to, I'm going to do enough design so I can get started. It doesn't mean that I have to think through every single thing, because typically it's not feasible in the very beginning of the project. Years ago, when we did strict waterfall, we were guessing. We weren't really right. We were right for the first month, and then things changed, and then we were afraid to go and update the book. So the whole thing that Agile has taught us is to be honest about what we know, and to take our best shot at it, get as much design as you can get done. More design is better, frankly. But then if a month later I learned something new about Angular, or maybe I'm using another technology and the technology gets updated, right? So React could be getting another user interface technology, could be updated in a new version, and that changes how my application is going to work. So doing enough design to get it right, but then being flexible enough to respond to change.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. I disagree with the Olcay because the DevOps has a discipline. It says that foster collaborative environment, and enterprise architecture has a discipline, and he says that foster collaborative environment. And I think this both of them says the same thing. So it can be together.
Well, one of the things that you want to drive is what are called feedback loops. In other words, a month into the life cycle, is our design right? Oh, we got it wrong. Okay, good. We realized we got it wrong before we're done. Now we still have time to fix it. So in DevOps, we have feedback loops. We take a systems view. I mean, that's another thing that we have to discuss, is that in an enterprise architecture world, I'm not just looking at one tiny piece of it. I'm not just looking at the UI. I'm also looking at how the database is designed, because that affects me. I got to pull data out of a database, or how the backend systems are working. So I take that systems view, and in an EA environment, I might have the database team come and teach me about the database, some of the ways in which they've come up with very effective ways to pull a lot of data out fast. Or I might have the back-end systems guys come and teach me how they're doing things. So we're communicating, we're collaborating, we're helping everybody understand the whole system. Because one of the things that's really bad is when the customer doesn't get the right information, the system's broken, and everybody says, oh, my piece is fine, the network's fine. But network's fine, but the user can't see his data. So and I've been in these enterprise architecture groups, both as a consultant and as a full-time chief architect. And what I'm always saying to people is, don't tell me your piece of it is fine. You're part of the team. We're going to make sure the customer can see what they need to see.
Yes, correct.
So we haven't talked about lean IT controls yet. So maybe we should talk about that next. So one of the reasons that folks criticize lots of discipline is they say I make too many rules. So I just want to point out that it's very important to create just enough rules so you don't make a mistake. So you meet your regulatory compliance, but if you have extra rules in there that are just silly, that are just, to create a lot of red tape, one of the things people often talk about is, what about change control? I have all these forms to fill out. Well, the purpose of change control is twofold. First off, to understand the risk of making a change or the risk of not making a change, and then also to communicate the change to everybody else on the team who might be affected. So the whole idea of having effective and lean controls is a really important concept. And in DevOps, we want to establish controls, but we don't want them to be so ridiculous that nobody can get their work done. We want just enough control so I don't make a mistake. It goes back to that race car. I want it to stay on the track, but I want it to go as fast as I can, but not go off the track. I don't want to get hurt, right?
All right.
What's your next question?
Next question is from Yusuf Özdemir. He asked, DevOps focus on constant testing and delivery, while the Agile process focus on constant changes. What kind of cooperation can be achieved between these two disciplines? He asks.
So this is such a great question. And that's why we've started talking about not just continuous integration, continuous delivery, continuous deployment, but continuous testing. And a lot of us have started using the term continuous everything. So when you start to think about it, all these disciplines really have to be thought about from the very beginning. So when I think about testing, I want to make sure that I've got enough unit testing. I want to make sure I've got enough integration testing. I've got to have regression testing. I've got to have functional testing to test things that are new features. I have to have non-functional testing like performance or pen testing. So the whole notion of testing is not something I do at the end, but that I start doing in the very beginning of the whole development lifecycle, and I do the right things throughout the whole cycle. So for example, if I'm doing test-driven development, I'm actually going to write the test harness before I write the code. And first time I run it, it's going to fail. And then I write the code and then it's going to pass. But I'm developing the automated testing throughout the whole life cycle. So Agile, if it's done properly, does think about testing throughout the whole life cycle. And in fact, testers are supposed to be co-located with the developers. Now, these days, that just means we are both on WebEx and sharing a screen together, which is really cool. So the notion, and one of the things that I often do is I make sure that the testers are talking directly to the developers. So the developers can say, here are the code changes that I've made. Here's how it might affect your testing. And then if something goes wrong, the testers can work directly with the developers. There's a partnership there. So at its essence, Agile is all about, and so is DevOps, all about cross-functional, high-performance teams. That's what a Scrum is, right? It's people with different skill sets working together. So I would say to you that continuous everything is just as important in an Agile environment as it is in an iterative waterfall environment. And it's just as important for Agile as it is for DevOps. And if organizations are not putting the right emphasis on proactive testing, upfront testing, building code that is just inherently secure and reliable, then they're not doing the right thing.
Yeah, thanks for answering. Very often solutions only address a limited scope of the system. You said that Agile self-organization and the cross-functionality, and the DevOps says cross-functionality. And many technology professionals are specialists and only have a narrow understanding of how the rest of the system works.
So isn't that the best part about being in IT right now? Because if I'm an expert in one part of it and you're an expert in a different part of it, we're always teaching each other.
Yes.
That's really the essence of what we're talking about here. In DevOps, there's a focus on that communication and collaboration. That's a very, I mean, remember we started in 2009, a bunch of thought leaders went to conferences and they talked about dev has one perspective and operations has a different perspective. It's this whole notion, you see the world differently than I do. And
Yes.
if we work together and we're sharing what we know, and we're sharing our understanding, we're both learning. And
Yes.
that's really what has to come across here is, you know, the user interface developer, the database developer, the guys who support the back-end systems, everybody has to, the security team. I'll give you a good example. A lot of
Yes.
times the security team knows a lot about specific security risks, but they don't know the code. And the developers know the code, but they might not know every single SQL injection that their code could get subjected to. So a lot of times my DevOps relationship is I'll do a scan on the code, I'll find some vulnerabilities, and then I get somebody from the security engineering team to share a screen with the guy who wrote the code, and they work out, well, how do I change the code in a way so I avoid that SQL injection, right?
Yeah.
So you go to companies, you go to groups like OWASP, they list, you know, top 10 security vulnerabilities. How do I get the guy who wrote the code, who knows the application really well, to work with the guy who really knows a lot about security so that I end up with the right functionality, but that code is safe and secure. So in DevOps, we're pushing this shared knowledge and information. And we have a bunch of practices, right? Effective communication and collaboration, right? That's one of them. You know, am I making sure that people can talk to each other? And that's no small thing. In a lot of organizations, they don't have, you know, effective communication. So the DevOps guy is supposed to be ensuring that that happens. We have another question?
No, the
Okay.
question is this: should we impose end-to-end responsibility? As you said that for entire system, should we impose end-to-end responsibility to teams?
So
Cross-functional.
yeah, so I may be responsible for something, but I should be able to call upon you as my colleague to help me, right?
You're
So, and think about it, a lot of times the systems are developed by more than one company working together. So you may be using a product with a vendor, and that vendor has to make support people available to you to resolve problems. So that whole idea of I may be responsible for my system, but I still depend upon you to work with me. So that, again, that's part of effective communication and collaboration. Let's make sure we cover some of the different practices too. Another one of them is ops using the same practices development, what we call left shift. So it's a whole notion. If I deploy code to development in one way, I use continuous integration. I got my Jenkins server, and every time somebody checks in or does a commit of their code, it automatically builds, packages, and pushes the code to a test environment. And then if I'm a Martin Fowler fan, I automatically kick off my automated testing. That's wonderful. But a lot of organizations do a completely different approach to deploy to production, and that's not wonderful. Yes. So in my work as a DevOps architect, I try to make sure that the same way that I'm going to deploy to production is the way that I deploy to all my environments. And that's where Docker containers is really super convenient. Because if I'm pushing a container, it couldn't get more simple. I can push the container to dev. I can push the container to integration, to QA, to staging, to production. It's just push of a container. Easy. So the whole idea that left shift is one of the techniques. We use the same practices across all of our environments. We talked about systems thinking, the whole idea of understanding the whole system. And yeah, I'm a specialist. I understand one tidy piece of it. I'm a DevOps engineer. I'm a configuration management expert. I know one part of this really backwards and forwards. but then I learn from people like you. You learn something from me. We're all working together. This whole idea of systems thinking and learning about the whole system. We talked about experimentation and feedback, right?
Right.
So when something goes wrong, I have an incident, okay? My system has got a problem, right? And hopefully I can fix it before customers, have any impact. But an incident in DevOps is a feedback loop. It's an indication to me that,
Experimentation. Yeah.
yes, so experimentation and feedback. A lot of times people say to me, should I do it this way or should I do another way? And I'll say, let's do a test. Let's be a good scientist. Let's try it out. Maybe we'll do a little proof of concept, a POC. We'll bake off between two different techniques. So DevOps focuses a lot on experimentation and feedback and the whole notion of automation and tools.
Yeah.
Years ago, we all said process is more important than tools. That's what we all said. And process is very important, right? But
Yes,
now in DevOps,
actually process is more important than the tools. You know that a fool with a tool is still a fool.
yeah, that's true. But I'll come back to your mom and that operation. I've got the best doctor in the world, and your mom has, fortunately, a very simple procedure she needs. Do you want the doctor using the best medical equipment? Do you want him to use some old medical equipment that's the tools in medicine are very, very important, right? They can make the difference between what kind of outcome. I had the experience. I built a nice room attached to my house so my mom could come and live with me. And I took care of her to the very last moment she was with me. And I watched the people building that room attached to my house. They had the best equipment. So in other professions, you want to have really good tools. Same thing is true in DevOps. So yes, process is more important, but tools are first-class citizens. They are very important. I want to have the right continuous integration server. I want to have the right deployment engineering. I want to have the right tools to monitor my environment and tell me if something is wrong. So in DevOps, we do focus a lot on the tools, and that's okay. That's a good thing.
It is very important because for automation is very, very important. So we need tools.
Yep. Now, another thing is we focus on the customer needs, right?
Yeah.
Or some people talk about value streams. And I mentioned before, if my network engineer says everything looks fine to me, but the customer can't put their card in the ATM and get out money and go to dinner with their family. So the whole notion of looking at things from the customer perspective, what are the things that I'm doing that deliver value to the customer? Can I make a change to the ATM and make the screen clearer and easier to see? Can I make a change to the hospital mobile app and tell people where they can go get tested for COVID-19? How do I impact the people who are using my services? So there's a real focus on DevOps, which comes from configuration management. We used to say there's a physical configuration audit and a functional configuration audit. The functional configuration audit and configuration management refers to, does the system do the right thing for the customer? Do you get the desired result? Is your train on time? Is the elevator work? So
how about failure? And maybe we have a lot of failure, and this is experiment. So embrace failure and use it to succeed. This is the DevOps discipline.
Yes. So failures, mistakes, incidents, problems, they're good things. They teach us, and we need to learn from them. So one of the things that I try to do in my work as a DevOps architect is I help the team look at failure a little differently. Failure is an opportunity to learn and succeed more. So, and the most important thing is that no one is afraid to talk honestly about what happened, right? So the father of quality management was Edward Deming, very famous man, very smart man. And one of the things he said is drive out fear. If you're in an organization and I'm afraid to admit that I made a mistake, then that's really bad. So the best organizations, people aren't afraid. They know they can admit they made a mistake. Everybody can learn from it. So incidents are important feedback loops and problems, things that go wrong. We have to do some root cause analysis. They are opportunities for us all to learn. Now, let's not make the same mistake twice. That's bad. But, you know, being able to learn from what we do and improve and teach each other, that is how we all really succeed.
Yeah, very, very important.
Yep.
And you said that we impose the end-to-end responsibility. So according to you, can we unite teams and expertise?
Yeah. So we have a concept that organizational structure has to be set up in a way where collaboration is compelling. So, you know, one of the things that I see is sometimes managers don't get along, and they're telling the teams, they don't talk to that other team, don't help them out. I had a fight with their manager the other day. I've actually heard people say this. It's the silliest thing in the world because it's not good for the company. So that's really being very disloyal. So the best organizational structure is where collaboration and communication is compelling, where everybody knows, you know, I can call you up and get on your calendar and get an hour from you and work together with you, because you have the kind of organization that really considers that kind of collaboration and communication to be very positive, to be very effective. And ultimately, this is all about building cross-functional high-performance teams, right? That's really where we want to get to, right? We want a team that is very high-performing. They can get systems done very quickly. They're very reliable, but also where you're bringing different kinds of expertise to the table. It's not just all one way of looking at things. And you know, this is kind of an interesting thing because, you know, if you and I come from the same neighborhood, we probably see things in a very similar way, right? We grew up in the same place, we speak the same language, the same culture, you know, and a lot of teams now are distributed all over the world, and people come from different perspectives. They have different ways of looking at things. Sometimes there's a little friction, and one of the important things in IT is that as IT professionals, we have to bring that cross-functional high performance view to the organization. That's really what DevOps is all about too.
Yeah, this is a good question. This is the Kadir question. Kadir asked, can you define the abilities, skills of an ideal member, especially a developer? Kadir is developer, and he asked, can you define the abilities, skills of ideal member of a Scrum team, especially developer?
Sure.
Can you define?
So the most important factor that I think a developer has to have is what I call technical flexibility. So a lot of times we come into a team and we say, I know Angular really well, so I want to work with Angular. But it could turn out that for the next project, using React is a better choice. Or it could turn out that you're an expert in Oracle, but for another project, MySQL is enough, and you don't have to spend the money using Oracle. So I think I just lost everybody from Oracle. Then they're going to drop off the webinar now. But the idea that you can be flexible about what technology you work with, and be able to, you know, inside of a couple of weeks, I had to do mobile apps. I had never done a mobile app before, so you know, I'm flexible enough that I can work with any technology. And in the Scrum, if your partner is having trouble, you got to be flexible enough to share a screen with them and help them, because that high performance cross-functional team is all about how do we all succeed? How do we all finish the work and deliver the value to the customer on time? So that may mean that I'm working with a technology tomorrow that I don't know so well, but somebody else knows it well, but they need a little bit of help. And so the notion of being very flexible in your technical skill, and I always like to say that you just love learning new technologies. That's really, really important. But if somebody is the type of person where they only like what they're comfortable with, they're good with databases, they don't want to hear anything else, they may not be the best person to be on that cross-functional team. It's much better if you have the type of approach where you like to share knowledge, learn from others, and be flexible about what technologies you work with.
Yeah. I think, yes, we have 2 minutes. Well, that's all the time we have today. And don't forget to like and share for continuation of these seminars held by Information Technologies Association. Bob, thanks for joining me.
Okay, it's been my pleasure.
I know that you are active on LinkedIn. Is that the best way for
Yes.
people to find you?
Yes, best way to find me is LinkedIn, LinkedIn/in/Bob Aiello, BOBAIELLO. So I look forward. Just please mention the webinar, because I get people trying to sell me paint and groceries on LinkedIn, and then I know you from the webinar. So it's been a pleasure. Maybe next time we'll talk about how to do DevOps assessments and how to get started, because that's really kind of the next step. Enterprise architecture is very important, but what you also want to do is assess where you're at right now, and then form a plan to iteratively improve your practices. And that could be a next topic together.
Yeah, thanks. Do send us your comments and suggestions for future programs, please. Until next time, I am Yusuf Özdemir, and for Bilişim Kahvesi Technical Talk, and my guest was Bob Aiello, and thanks. Have a nice day.